The army carried with it 1,800 wounded men. We had succeeded in constructing about 20 litters for the general officers such as Lannes and Vaux, Duroc and Crozier. The two latter were aides-de-camp of the general-in-chief. Crozier died in the desert. The infected that could not bear a long journey were deposited at El Arish, but placed without the fort under the protection of a detachment of infantry that was to defend them against the attacks of the Arabs. Several of them recovered, and in particular I may name a young Captain Dijon, who commanded the breach battery during the whole siege. He was a most intrepid officer, and fortune spared him. He is now a lieutenant general. We lost very few of our wounded while crossing the desert, and the army made with great éclat its entrance into the capital of Egypt. This Syrian campaign has been judged with great severity by our enemies, and during the reign of the emperor, it was not allowed to speak impartially of its result. It was undoubtedly indispensable to enter into Syria to repel Ibrahim Bey, and the troops with Djezar Pasha was preparing to launch against Egypt. The operations were conducted with great skill. The failure of St. John of Acre must only be attributed to some fatal circumstances, independent of the general-in-chief, but we must not therefore conclude with General Berthier that the French army really gained all the advantages it expected to reap in Syria. We lost in that province 3,000 men, several skillful generals, and hopeful officers. And we were obliged to abandon the towns we had taken. In quitting Syria, we left the country just as it was before we entered it. Barren victories must not be looked upon as real advantages, and if General Bonaparte had remained in Egypt, he would undoubtedly have beaten the Grand Vizier when he came the following year to drive us out of Egypt and repulse the English who had taken Abu Qir. But most certainly he could not have begun the campaign of Syria over again, having no means of receiving supplies from France, so that he would, with difficulty, have been able to maintain himself some years longer in Egypt. During the campaign of Syria, General Desaix had succeeded in keeping quiet possession of Upper Egypt and reducing Murad Bey to the condition of a fugitive. Lower Egypt had been the scene of many troubles, occasioned by a sort of fanatic who styled himself as the Angel El Mahadeh. But General Lanous pursued him with so much vigor that he soon destroyed the troops he had collected. The landing season was fast approaching. The general-in-chief did not wish to leave Cairo. He therefore resumed the administration of the country. He busied himself with filling up the vacant places in the army and completing the corps. He had posted himself with a part of his cavalry near the pyramids, waiting for the accounts of General Desaix would transmit him respecting Murad Bey, whom that general was pursuing in his last entrenchment, and who it was supposed would throw himself into the oases that are situated at a short distance from the pyramids. It is a well-known fact that the Great Pyramid had been opened several centuries ago by the Arabs. General Bonaparte had resolved to visit the interior of that structure with Messieurs Monge, Berthier, and Duroc. I only mention this circumstance because his name has been written in the great gallery leading to the chamber called the King's Chamber. He had scarcely come out of the pyramid when an express sent off by General Marmont, who commanded at Alexandria, brought him tidings of the landing of a Turkish army at Abu Qir, where they had made themselves masters of the great redoubt and of the fort, after having massacred our soldiers that defended them. The attack was quite unexpected, and the Turkish army was so numerous that General Marmont had not thought fit to march against them at the head of his garrison, for fear he might not be able to prevent their disembarking, and might, however, endanger the city of Alexandria, the fortifications of which were not yet completed, and which besides contained all the resources we possessed in artillery and ammunition. It was to be expected that after the enemy had taken the fort, he would spread about the country and attack either Alexandria or Rosetta. Instead of that, he fortified himself in the peninsula of Abu Qir, evidently waiting for Murad Bey, with whose desperate condition he was not yet acquainted. General Bonaparte resolved, therefore, to march rapidly against him. The distance from the pyramid to Aboukir is more than 80 leagues. On the fourth day, the army arrived at Alexandria. On the 7th of Thermidor, it was assembled within a league of Aboukir, under the orders of the division generals Lannes and Lanus, and Murat for the cavalry. The enemy was retrenched in front of Aboukir, on the sandy hillocks of which he had made redoubts, and under the protection of English gunboats. His force consisted of about 17,000 men with 12 pieces of cannon. The general quickly made his dispositions and ordered General d'Estaing to attack the enemy's left, which he put to flight after a long resistance. The Turks fled towards the village of Aboukir, but a part of the cavalry that was in the center pursued them, sabered, and drove them into the sea. The right of the enemy was attacked with equal vigor. The division of Lannes made themselves masters of the redoubt, which, being turned by a squadron of cavalry, the Turks had no other resource left but to throw themselves into the sea. It was a horrible sight to contemplate nearly 10,000 men, of whom nothing was to be seen but their heads covered with turbans, and who were seeking in vain to reach the English fleet anchored at more than half a league from the shore. 2,000 men had sought a refuge on the strand, at the foot of a rock that covered them. It was impossible to make them comprehend that they might surrender by laying down their arms. We were obliged to kill them all to a man, but they sold dearly their lives. General Murat was wounded by a bullet in his head. Guibert, aide-de-camp to the general-chief, was killed, and the corps of engineers that had already suffered so severely lost Colonel Crétin, who had succeeded to the post of General Caffarelli. Wounded by 2 bullets, the colonel was lying before the door of a house in the village occupied by the Turks. 8 persons had already been killed or wounded in seeking to get him away. Bertrand, who was at that time a major of engineers, devoted himself to save his commander. He rushed into the house, followed by 20 sappers, and succeeded in killing every one of the Turks. But he was severely wounded, and Colonel Crétin did not survive the injuries that he had suffered. After the victory was gained, the fort of Aboukir still remained to be taken. General Lannes, who was not yet recovered from the wounds he had received at St. John of Acre, got the command of the troops that were to invest the place. I was with him. The day after the departure of the general-chief, I accompanied General Lannes on a visit to the posts when a furious sortie of Turkish troops surprised our advanced posts, and the unfortunate general received a bullet in his leg. It was the 8th wound he got from firearms. Fortunately, the enemy had no water in the fort of Aboukir, so that he surrendered 4 days after the battle. During the short stay of the general-chief at Aboukir, he had some communications with Sir Sidney Smith by the medium of his secretary. We had not received for a long time any news from Europe, and the English Commodore took a malicious pleasure in acquainting us by the newspapers of the situation of the Republic. We learned that the whole south of Italy was evacuated, that war was waging on the frontiers of Piedmont, and that France was in the most desperate condition. General Bonaparte took great care not to let the army know these dismal accounts, but from that moment he resolved to return to Europe, convinced that he alone was capable of repairing the evils of the bad government of the Directory had accumulated on the country. After the surrender of the fort of Aboukir, the defense of which had only lasted 4 days, General Bonaparte went back to Cairo, but not before he had given secret orders to General Guillaume, who commanded the Marines at Alexandria, to arm and provision the 2 frigates Miron and Carrère. He then spread the report that he was going to travel to Upper Egypt, but that he would perhaps first take a trip to the Delta. The news of his intended journey put everybody on the alert in the expectation of receiving his praises. He spent a fortnight in regulating once more the administration of Egypt, provisioning its strong places, and writing to the Grand Vizier. And when all his measures were duly taken, he went down the Nile again, after having appointed General Kleber to meet him in Alexandria, that he might deliver over the command into his hands. But that general not having arrived in time, his dispatches were sent to him. And at 10 o'clock at night, the general-in-chief, accompanied by his staff and leaving his horses on the shore, embarked on board the Muron. He took with him Generals Berthier and Cantillon, Messieurs Monge and Berthier, and his aides-de-camp, Eugène Beauharnais, Duroc, Merlin, and his private secretary. In the frigate Carrère went General Lannes and Murat, both wounded, Marmont, Monsieur Denon, Castat, and Percival Grandmaison. The scientific commission had been for some months in Upper Egypt. Our passage presented many difficulties. The secretary of Sir Sidney Smith, in a conversation with me, had allowed the observation to escape that there was a great advantage in blockading out of sight. We were therefore to expect that we should find the English commodore in our way. In that case, the frigate Carrère had received orders to engage so as to give the Muron time to escape, but both the frigates were Venetian-built ships and very bad sailors. It became therefore necessary to make use of some stratagem to avoid being seen. General Cantillon thought the best way would be to run for 30 days along the flat shores of Africa where no ships reconnoitre, and to make short tacks of half a league without ever standing far out to sea. The time appeared very long to us all, for it would have been imprudent to keep a light at night, so that we were obliged to go to bed with the sun. Our days were spent in reading or discussing various topics. The inexhaustible information of our two learned traveling companions filled up our time in a very agreeable manner. Plutarch frequently came to our assistance, and sometimes during our long evenings, the general-in-chief would tell us ghost stories, in which he was very clever. The situation of France and the future state of the country were often the subjects of his reflections. He never mentioned the government of the Directory, but with a degree of severity that savored of contempt. In the meanwhile, his conversation never betrayed what he intended to do, though some words that escaped him, some musings, and some indirect insinuations gave a wide scope to our surmises. His administration in Egypt had been pure, his operations full of genius. But was that enough to clear him in the eyes of a government that feared him and was far from wishing him well? He would be obliged to make war. But could he submit to the plans of a government deprived of military knowledge that might place him in an awkward position and give his rivals means of success which they would refuse to allow him? These different ideas made him very thoughtful. At last, the east wind began to blow in a constant manner. We passed Cape Bone during the night, and we arrived speedily at Ajaccio. This little town is the birthplace of the general-in-chief. He had left it 8 years before, when he was only a captain of artillery. At the sight of this place, his heart was deeply affected. Coming from Egypt, where the plague still prevailed, it was impossible for us to enter the port. The inhabitants, surprised to see the admiral's flag hoisted on the mainmast, rushed towards the shore. But when they learned that their illustrious countryman was on board, his old friends and relations threw themselves into a number of boats and came on board the frigate and broke through the quarantine. There was, however, no great danger, for after 44 days' navigation, we had not one sick person on board. Among the crowd that was bustling round the state cabin, there was an old woman dressed in black who continually held up her hands to the general, saying, "Caro figlio," without being able to attract his attention. At last he perceived her and cried out, "Madre!" It was his nurse, who is still living at the moment I write this. The general-in-chief learned here, though in a confused manner, what had happened in France during his absence. Italy was lost, and Messina continued fighting like a lion in Switzerland. In the interior, the confusion had been great. Trialhar and Merlin were no longer members of the Directory. Their places were occupied by the lawyer Groyer and General Moulin. On hearing the latter name, the general-in-chief turned to Berthier and said, "Who is this General Moulin? I never heard his name mentioned before," answered Berthier. General Bonaparte put the same question to all of us and received the same answer. That man's nomination caused him to reflect deeply. Astonished not to see any of the authorities from the land, he soon learned that the members of the municipality and those of the departmental directory had sent each other to prison. The commissary of the government, a stranger to the country, was sole master in that state of confusion. The cabinet revolution had soon become known at Ajaccio, and the different parties found it the most natural thing in the world to persecute one another. It was necessary to reestablish some order in the midst of so much anarchy. In consequence, the general-in-chief went to his own house, sent for the magistrates whom he delivered out of prison, exhorted them to peace and concord, and the next morning the two frigates left the port, sailing in the direction of the Isle of Hyer. The whole of the first day our navigation was very favorable. We perceived already the hills of Provence, and our joy at returning to our dear country was carried to its highest pitch, when the sailor who was on the lookout said he espied two large ships in the west. They could be no other than the enemy's ships, and soon several discharges of cannon seemed to indicate that they had discovered us. The general-in-chief called a council, and the universal opinion, even that of the admiral, was that General Bonaparte had nothing else to do than to throw himself into postboat that accompanied us and return to Ajaccio. He was indignant at such advice. "Do you think," said he, "that I can consent to run away like a coward when fortune has never ceased to favor me? Let us continue our course. My destiny is not to be taken and die here." So we went on, but instead of steering, as we had done till then, in the direction of the Isles of Hyer, we resolved to go to Fréjus. The general-in-chief had judged rightly. The enemy, whom we distinguished with facility, because they were under the setting sun, could not perceive us because we were in the shade. After standing on the whole night, the two frigates reached the road of Fréjus. The sanitary establishment was situated at about a quarter of a league from the town. An officer of the frigate went towards the shore in a boat. We distinguished him perfectly well. Some men came to meet him, but after a few minutes we perceived a great confusion. Some of the people ran towards the town, and soon after, the strand was covered with an immense multitude of persons. The boats were filled, and, as at Ajaccio, a number of men rushed on board of the ship through the portholes. The cries of "Long live Bonaparte" resounded all over the country. A white horse was brought for him, and he went to the house of a brother of the Abbé Sieyès, who lived at Fréjus. The sentiments that animated the whole population were expressed in a manner that did not leave even the shadow of a doubt. "You alone can save France," was a universal cry. "She'll perish but for you. It is heaven that sent you. Seize the reins of government." His journey to Lyon was a triumphal march. We arrived in the city at 7 o'clock in the morning. His having landed was already known, and his arrival wished for with an ardor impossible to describe. Lyon was still famous for its antipathy to the Republican government, and we imagined that the general would not stop. But to our great astonishment, he declared that he intended to spend the remainder of the day there. He received all the authorities and most distinguished citizens, without explaining himself, however, on the direct insinuations that were made to him to place himself at the head of government, but receiving with a cold severity the Republicans that had organized a constitutional club and who came to congratulate him. He had been invited to go to the theater of the Célestins, where a piece and a song had been prepared for the occasion. He chose one of the boxes on a level with the pit, and Duroc, having by his order placed himself in front of the box, the call for Bonaparte grew so violent and so unanimous that the general-in-chief was obliged to change places with him during the whole representation.